My name is Evelyn Hayes. I'm 32 years old, and I never, ever imagined I'd be standing in the most important shareholders' meeting of my career, not to present the market analysis I'd bled over for months, but with a cheap, lukewarm coffee carafe in my hand, being directed to serve the very men who were about to decide the company's future based on my unseen work. The humiliation was a raw, physical thing, coiling in my stomach like a viper. But as Mr. Henderson, our condescending CEO, gestured dismissively for me to make sure everyone has a top-up, dear, a different kind of fire started to burn. He had no idea, none of them did, that the deer he just ordered around like a waitress held the key to the very financing that kept his precious company afloat. They thought I was just a cog, a quiet analyst. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The air in the boardroom that morning was thick with a self-importance that only a gathering of men in $1,000 suits can generate. I'd been there since 6 a.m., triple-checking the presentation slides. Slides I had designed, data I had crunched, projections I had painstakingly forecasted. My actual role was Senior Market Strategist, a title I'd worked tirelessly for, navigating the subtle and not-so-subtle sexism of sterling price investments for 5 long years. I'd poured my soul into the Q3 financial strategy, the one they were all there to pontificate over. I'd even rehearsed, in the privacy of my tiny apartment, how I would answer their questions, should my direct manager, David, who was notorious for taking credit for my work, actually allow me to speak. The shareholders were filing in, a sea of stern faces and expensive cologne. Mr. Henderson was at the head of the long mahogany table, beaming, shaking hands, exuding a confidence that, I knew, was built on the foundations of other people's labor, often mine. I was standing near the back, by the projector, ready to assist David with the slides. He strolled in, late as usual, gave me a cursory nod, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he turned to me just as the last shareholder was settling in. "Evelyn," he said, his voice loud enough for the first few rows to hear, "the catering seems to be a bit behind. Could you be a doll and manage the coffee and refreshments for everyone? Make sure Mr. Albright gets his with 2 sugars. He's key for this vote." He didn't even look at me properly, already turning to schmooze with someone. A doll, manage the coffee. My blood ran cold, then boiling hot. I could feel the eyes on me, not curious, not sympathetic, just expectant. As if, of course, the only woman in a non-secretarial role in that room, other than the actual secretary who was busy taking minutes, was there to serve them. I saw a few smirks. Mark, the office sycophant who always got the plum assignments despite his incompetence, gave a little snort that he tried to cover as a cough. The injustice was a physical blow. I had spent weeks, no, months, preparing for the substance of this meeting. My insights were critical to the discussion they were about to have, and I was being relegated to a waitress. For a moment, I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to say, "Actually, David, I'm the senior market strategist who developed the entire financial model you're about to present. Perhaps you can get the coffee." But the years of being conditioned to not make waves, to pick your battles, to not be labeled difficult or emotional, a death sentence for a woman in finance, held my tongue. The silence stretched. Mr. Henderson then looked over, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "Everything all right, Evelyn? Coffee's important, keeps the mind sharp," he boomed, followed by a few sycophantic chuckles. My mind raced. If I refused, I'd be labeled insubordinate. If I complied, the humiliation would be complete. But as I looked at their smug, entitled faces, a different thought, a dangerous, thrilling thought, began to form. They saw me as insignificant. They had no idea who my family was, or the silent, substantial influence we wielded in the financial world. They certainly didn't know that Sterling Price Investments' single largest private credit line, the one that Henderson had been bragging about securing last year, came from a private equity firm quietly owned by my grandfather, with my mother as a majority partner. A credit line that was up for review next month. A slow, cold smile, one they couldn't see, touched my lips internally. I picked up the carafe from the side table where the caterers had indeed left it, along with a stack of styrofoam cups, not even proper china for the high and mighty. "Of course, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice surprisingly even. "Wouldn't want anyone's mind to be less than sharp for this important discussion." I started to pour, moving around the table, making eye contact with each man. David, smugly starting his presentation using my slides. Mr. Albright, who winked at me when I remembered his 2 sugars. Mark, who couldn't quite meet my eye. Each pour was a promise. Each deferential nod was a ticking clock. They thought they were putting me in my place. They had no idea I was about to remove theirs. Have you ever been so publicly underestimated or humiliated at work, made to feel small despite your contributions? Share your story in the comments below. It's a terrible feeling, and it's important to know we're not alone. And please, don't forget to subscribe if you want to see exactly how I turned this little coffee service into their worst nightmare. That moment, with the coffee carafe in my hand, wasn't an isolated incident. It was the festering wound of 5 years of similar, if less public humiliations at Sterling Price Investments. 5 years of biting my tongue, of swallowing indignities, of watching my work be credited to others while I was patted on the head and told I was a valuable team player, which I've learned is often code for good little worker bee who doesn't cause trouble. It started subtly, as these things often do. In my first year, fresh out of business school with top honors, I was brimming with ideas. I remember proposing a new risk assessment model for emerging markets. I'd spent weeks on it, late nights fueled by cheap takeout and a burning desire to prove myself. I presented it in a team meeting to David Miller, my department head, a man whose ambition far outstripped his actual talent. He listened, nodded thoughtfully, and then said, "Interesting, Evelyn. Very academic. We'll take it under advisement." 2 months later, at the quarterly review with Mr. Henderson, David unveiled the Miller Risk Paradigm, which was, shocker, my model almost verbatim, just with a few superficial tweaks and his name plastered all over it. I sat in that meeting, my stomach churning, as Henderson praised David's innovative thinking and proactive approach. David even had the audacity to catch my eye and give me a small, patronizing smile, as if we were in on some delightful secret. The secret, I realized, was that my contributions were his to claim. That was the first major lesson. My ideas were free for the taking, especially by David. He was a connoisseur of intellectual property theft, a magpie drawn to shiny concepts he couldn't generate himself. He'd assign me the complex, data-heavy research, the foundational work that required hours of meticulous analysis. Then he'd swoop in at the last minute, refine it, which usually meant adding a few buzzwords and his signature, and present it as his own strategic masterpiece. If I ever dared to hint that perhaps my name should also be on the report, or that I'd originated the concept, I'd get the classic gaslighting response. "Evelyn, we're a team. It's not about individual glory." And surely you remember I suggested this line of inquiry initially? My memory apparently was always faulty when it came to his genius. Mr. Henderson, our CEO, was a different breed of antagonist. He wasn't overtly malicious like David could be. Instead, he operated with a kind of benevolent sexism that was almost more insidious. He loved to tell stories about his own daughters, how proud he was of them, usually in the context of their marriages or their children. In his eyes, women were to be protected, cherished, and ultimately kept away from the real levers of power. He'd call me kiddo or young lady well into my late 20s and early 30s, even as I was outperforming men a decade my senior. During important client meetings, if I spoke up with a salient point, he'd often follow with, "That's a good point, sweetheart." Now, as John was saying, effectively cutting me off and redirecting the conversation back to one of the men. It was a constant, subtle erosion of my authority, my credibility. He genuinely seemed to believe he was being encouraging, but his encouragement always came with an invisible ceiling. And then there was Mark Jenkins, the office golden boy. Mark wasn't particularly bright, nor was he especially hard-working, but he was charming in a smarmy way, knew how to laugh at all of Henderson's bad jokes, and was an expert at office politics. He was David's protege, and the two of them formed an impenetrable wall of mediocrity that consistently got rewarded. I remember one specific project, a critical turnaround strategy for a failing subsidiary. I pitched a bold, data-backed plan. David assigned the project to Mark. Mark, who then spent the next 3 weeks delegating tasks to me, asking me for my input on every single aspect, essentially having me do all the heavy lifting. He then presented my strategy, fumbled through the Q&A, and was lauded by Henderson for his leadership and taking initiative. Mark got a promotion and a hefty bonus. I got a good job, Evelyn, for supporting Mark. The unfairness of it was a bitter pill I choked down daily. The work environment itself was a testament to this culture. Sterling Price was a boys' club, through and through. Important discussions happened over golf games I was never invited to, or at steak dinners where the conversation inevitably turned to topics designed to exclude or make any woman present uncomfortable. Invitations to after-work drinks were always carefully curated. If I was invited, it was usually as an afterthought, and I'd find myself on the periphery, listening to boasts and backslapping, feeling like an anthropologist studying a strange, self-congratulatory tribe. The slights weren't always about big projects or promotions. They were in the everyday interactions. Being asked to order lunch for a meeting I was supposed to be a key participant in. Being mistaken for David's assistant by new clients, an assumption David rarely corrected. Having my carefully prepared reports summarized by a male colleague because it was assumed he could distill it better for the executives. Once, during a tense negotiation, when I firmly held my ground on a valuation, the opposing counsel, an older man, actually chuckled and said, "She's a feisty one, isn't she, Henderson?" And Henderson just smiled, as if it were a compliment. The implication was clear. My assertiveness wasn't professional, it was feisty, a trait to be indulgently observed, not seriously respected. Each incident, on its own, might have seemed like something I could or should overlook. Don't be too sensitive, I'd tell myself. Pick your battles. But the cumulative effect was soul-crushing. It was like being slowly buried alive. There were so many nights I went home, sat in my small apartment, and just replayed the day's indignities, the casual dismissals, the stolen credit. I'd dissect every word, every glance, wondering if I was the problem. Was I not assertive enough? Too assertive? Was I misinterpreting things? The constant self-doubt was exhausting. It chipped away at my confidence, despite the fact that, objectively, my work was excellent. My performance reviews, always delivered by David, were a masterclass in faint praise. Evelyn is diligent and reliable, needs to develop more executive presence. Executive presence, I soon learned, was code for not being a man. Why did I stay for 5 long years? Initially, it was the prestige of the Sterling Price name on my resume. I thought I could learn, grow, make connections. I believed, perhaps naively, that if I just kept my head down, worked harder than everyone else, and delivered exceptional results, eventually, they would have no choice but to recognize my value. I thought meritocracy was a real thing, even in a viper pit like that. I also, if I'm being honest, didn't want to admit defeat. Leaving would have felt like letting them win, like confirming their unspoken belief that I didn't belong. So I stayed, absorbing the blows, my resentment simmering beneath a carefully constructed professional facade. The coffee incident wasn't the start of my anger. It was merely the spark that finally ignited a 5-year stockpile of fuel. And as I stood there, carafe in hand, I knew that the polite, accommodating Evelyn they thought they knew was about to burn their carefully constructed world to the ground. In that desolate landscape of Sterling Price Investments, where recognition was a mirage and respect was a foreign currency, there was one, just one, unexpected oasis. Mr. Arthur Davies. He wasn't a colleague in my department, nor was he a senior executive who could directly shield me from the daily onslaught. Mr. Davies was the head of the archival department, a quiet, almost reclusive man in his late 60s, who had been with the company since its inception, long before it became the testosterone-fueled battleground it was now. Most people barely knew he existed, tucked away in the basement amidst dusty ledgers and forgotten company histories. I first encountered Mr. Davies about 2 years into my tenure. I was researching historical market trends for a particularly complex project, one David had predictably dumped on me, with a vague directive and an impossible deadline. The online databases were insufficient. I needed access to physical records, old annual reports, and investment committee minutes from decades past. HR pointed me towards the archives, a place I hadn't even known existed. The basement was cool and dim, a stark contrast to the bright, sterile, and hypermasculine environment upstairs. It smelled of old paper and history. And there, amidst towering shelves, was Mr. Davies, peering at a document through a magnifying glass. He looked up, startled, as I introduced myself. He wasn't like the others. There was no condescension in his eyes, no immediate sizing up or dismissal. He simply listened, his gaze thoughtful, as I explained what I needed. Over the next few weeks, I spent many hours in the archives. Mr. Davies, it turned out, was a veritable encyclopedia of the company's past and, surprisingly, possessed an incredibly sharp financial mind. He'd not only locate the documents I needed, often anticipating my next request, but he'd also offer quiet insights. The Atherton acquisition of '87, he'd muse, pulling out a faded file. They nearly went bankrupt overpaying for that one. Henderson Sr. was a riverboat gambler, not like our current Mr. Henderson. Or, this particular strategy you're researching, Miss Hayes, it bears a striking resemblance to something young Alastair Finch proposed in '92. Brilliant man, Finch. They pushed him out, of course. Too innovative for the old guard then. He never overtly criticized the current leadership, but his observations were laced with a subtle understanding of the company's internal politics and its recurring patterns. He saw things. He noticed things. He saw me. He saw the hours I put in, the depth of my research, the intelligence behind my questions. Unlike everyone else upstairs who only saw a woman to be managed or dismissed, Mr. Davies saw a mind at work. One afternoon, I was particularly frustrated. David had just presented another one of my detailed reports as his own, this time to a major potential client. I was fuming internally, but had to maintain my composure. I retreated to the archives, ostensibly to look up some data, but really just to escape. Mr. Davies found me staring blankly at a page, my shoulders slumped. He didn't pry. He simply said, "A difficult day, Miss Hayes?" I just nodded, unable to trust my voice. He then pulled out an old, leather-bound volume. It was a collection of early company prospectuses. He opened it to a page detailing a particularly innovative financial instrument from the 1970s. "This," he said, tapping the page, "was designed by a woman named Eleanor Vance. She was the chief economist here for a brief period, brilliantly ahead of her time. The company made a fortune from this model for years." He paused, then looked at me directly. "Her name is nowhere on the public accolades, of course. Her direct supervisor, a Mr. Carmichael, took all the credit, became CEO a few years later on the back of it." He closed the book gently. "Some things, Miss Hayes, unfortunately, have a long history. It wasn't a solution, but it was validation. It was an acknowledgement that what I was experiencing wasn't unique, wasn't a figment of my imagination, and wasn't my fault." He saw the pattern. He understood the injustice. He didn't offer platitudes or tell me to lean in. He offered a shared history, a quiet understanding that meant more than any pep talk could. From then on, our interactions deepened. He became a silent mentor. I'd sometimes share my frustrations, carefully worded, and he'd listen, offering not advice on how to navigate the office politics. He knew that was a losing game for someone like me in that environment. But rather, he'd subtly steer me toward strengthening my own skills, my own knowledge, independent of the company. He'd point out obscure financial theories, recommend books on economic history, or discuss complex case studies with an intellectual rigor I found nowhere else in Sterling Price. He was, in his own quiet way, arming me. He also knew about my family, not the specifics of their wealth or their connection to Sterling Price's financing. I was always very careful to keep that completely separate and hidden. But he knew I came from a family with a strong financial background. He'd once seen me reading a rather obscure journal on private equity, one my mother subscribed to, and remarked, "Your family has good taste in reading material, Miss Hayes. Not many appreciate the nuances of leveraged buyouts." It was a fleeting comment, but it showed his perceptiveness. Mr. Davies never tried to intervene directly in my battles with David or Henderson. He knew his place in the company hierarchy. He was the keeper of records, not a power broker. But his quiet support, his intellectual respect, was a lifeline. It reminded me that my worth wasn't defined by the narrow, biased perceptions of the men upstairs. He saw my competence, my intelligence, and my resilience. In a world designed to make me feel small and invisible, Arthur Davies made me feel seen. And that, in its own way, was a powerful form of allyship. It kept a small flame of defiance alive within me, a flame that the coffee incident was about to fan into a raging inferno. He was the one person who, I felt, would understand the satisfaction of the reckoning to come, even if he would never explicitly say so. While they were busy underestimating me, patting me on the head, and stealing my work, I was doing something else. I was building. Silently, meticulously, I was constructing my escape route and, more importantly, my eventual counteroffensive. The daily grind of disrespect at Sterling Price was demoralizing, yes, but it also fueled a quiet rage that I channeled into something productive, something they couldn't see and therefore couldn't sabotage. My family, the Hayes, we weren't just comfortable. We were a legacy in the world of private equity and venture capital. My grandfather, Alistair Hayes, the same Alistair Finchmister, Davies had once mentioned who'd changed his name after leaving a stifling corporate environment decades ago to build his own empire, had founded Hayes Capital, a firm known for its shrewd investments and, more recently under my mother's leadership, its focus on ethical and sustainable ventures. I'd grown up around dinner table conversations about market valuations, due diligence, and hostile takeovers. Finance was in my blood. But I'd wanted to make my own way, to prove myself on my own merits, which is why I'd initially kept my family background a closely guarded secret at Sterling Price. I didn't want the Hayes name to open doors. I wanted my skills to do it. Oh, the irony. After the first few years of being consistently undervalued, I realized that making my own way within their broken system was a fool's errand. So I started playing a different game. My evenings and weekends, which David and Henderson probably imagined I spent lamenting my stalled career or engaging in feminine pursuits, were actually dedicated to Hayes Capital. Officially, I was still just Evelyn Hayes, senior market strategist at Sterling Price. Unofficially, I was becoming an increasingly vital, albeit behind-the-scenes analyst and strategist for my family's firm. My mother, Catherine Hayes, is a force of nature. She'd inherited my grandfather's sharp intellect and his disdain for corporate dinosaurs. When I tentatively started sharing some of my experiences at Sterling Price, not as complaints, but as case studies in mismanagement, she listened intently. She saw the toxic culture for what it was, but she also saw the value in the intelligence I was gathering, the first-hand understanding of how such firms operated, and how they could be vulnerable. "They're dinosaurs, Evie," she said to me one evening, after I'd recounted another particularly galling instance of David taking credit for a complex financial model I'd built. "And dinosaurs, for all their bluster, eventually go extinct. The key is to understand their weaknesses." So I became her eyes and ears on the inside, in a way. Not in a corporate espionage sense, but by simply observing, learning, and analyzing the very real, very flawed strategies and internal politics of a company like Sterling Price. While they saw me as a glorified secretary, I was taking mental notes, understanding their risk appetite, their client dependencies, their operational inefficiencies. And all this intelligence I was feeding back, in anonymized and ethical ways, into the broader strategic discussions at Hayes Capital. More importantly, I started actively working on Hayes Capital projects. My mother began assigning me discrete due diligence tasks, market research for potential acquisitions, and even asked for my input on structuring deals. It was challenging, demanding work, often done in the dead of night after a full day of being belittled at Sterling Price. But it was also incredibly fulfilling. At Hayes Capital, my ideas were heard, my analysis was valued, and my contributions were acknowledged. I was treated as an equal, a professional. I was thriving, even if it was in secret. I learned about the intricacies of leveraged finance, about negotiating term sheets, about the power dynamics between lenders and borrowers. I became particularly interested in the credit lines and financing agreements that kept companies like Sterling Price afloat. It was a dry subject for some, but for me, it became a fascination. I saw the web of dependencies, the fine print in the loan covenants, the triggers that could cause a financial house of cards to tumble. About 18 months before the fateful shareholders' meeting, my mother had a pivotal conversation with me. Hayes Capital was looking to diversify its debt portfolio, and an opportunity had arisen to become a significant creditor to a mid-cap investment firm. That firm, through a series of intermediaries and special-purpose vehicles common in high finance, turned out to be Sterling Price Investments. They were seeking a substantial private credit line to fund an expansion strategy, the very strategy David was now presenting, using my slides. "They have no idea it's us, of course," my mother had said, a glint in her eye. "The offer is through a subsidiary, very arm's length, but we'd effectively be one of their largest, if not the largest, private lenders." She paused. "What do you think, Evie? From your unique perspective?" My unique perspective. For years, Sterling Price had treated me as if I had no perspective worth considering. Now I held a significant piece of their future in my hands, and they didn't even know it. We discussed the financials of Sterling Price in detail, their reported numbers, but also the inefficiencies and questionable leadership I'd witnessed firsthand. I pointed out the over-reliance on a few key rainmakers, the lack of genuine innovation, the toxic culture that was undoubtedly hampering long-term growth, even if the short-term figures looked acceptable. The decision to extend the credit line was made, but with stringent oversight clauses and specific performance metrics tied to its renewal. Clauses I subtly helped shape based on my intimate knowledge of Sterling Price's operational vulnerabilities. I knew which metrics would be hardest for them to genuinely meet without significant and unlikely internal reform. The credit line was approved. Henderson had crowed about it internally, presenting it as a triumph of his leadership, a testament to the market's confidence in Sterling Price. He never knew the real story behind his triumph. He never knew that one of the key people who had scrutinized his company's viability before extending that lifeline was the same woman he'd soon ask to serve coffee. So, as I walked around that boardroom, carafe in hand, I wasn't just some humiliated underling. I was a silent stakeholder, a hidden architect of their financial reality. My silent rise hadn't been about climbing Sterling Price's rickety biased corporate ladder. It had been about building my own ladder. A stronger, more powerful one, right alongside them, completely unnoticed. They were playing checkers. I had been learning to play chess. And the beauty of it was, they were so blinded by their own arrogance and my perceived insignificance that they never even saw the board. If this story of quiet preparation and turning the tables resonates with you, give this video a like. It really helps support the channel and lets me know you appreciate these kinds of empowerment narratives. I finished pouring the last cup of coffee, placing it gently in front of a particularly pompous-looking shareholder who hadn't even bothered to make eye contact. David was well into his presentation, droning on about synergistic growth opportunities and leveraging core competencies, all phrases lifted directly from the executive summary I'd written. He was on slide 17, the one detailing the projected ROI for the new expansion, data I'd spent nearly 3 months compiling and verifying. He gestured grandly towards the screen, his voice oozing false confidence. "And as you can see, gentlemen, with this robust strategy, which my team and I meticulously developed, we project a conservative 25% increase in net profits within 3 fiscal years." A murmur of approval went around the table. Mr. Henderson beamed, looking like a proud father whose son had just hit a home run. Mark Jenkins, sitting near David, nodded vigorously, trying to catch Henderson's eye to share in the reflected glory. My moment had come. The humiliation of the coffee service had solidified my resolve into something diamond hard. I cleared my throat, not loudly, but enough to cut through the self-congratulatory haze. "Excuse me, David," I said, my voice calm, cool, and carrying surprisingly well in the suddenly quiet room. All eyes turned to me. David looked annoyed, a flash of anger in his eyes at the interruption. "Evelyn, we're in the middle of a rather important point. Can this wait?" he snapped, his tone dismissive. "Actually, David, it can't," I replied, taking a step forward from the side of the room. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a mixture of surprise and irritation. There seems to be a slight, or rather a significant inaccuracy in your presentation and in your attribution of its development. David's face began to flush. Inaccuracy? Evelyn, this data has been triple verified. Perhaps you should stick to refreshments. A few nervous titters went around the table. Mark Jenkins snickered openly. "Oh, I'm quite familiar with the data, David," I said, my voice hardening. "Seeing as I'm the one who compiled it, analyzed it, and wrote the report you're currently plagiarizing. The report, I might add, that you claimed as your own after I submitted it to you 3 weeks ago." A stunned silence fell over the room. David's jaw dropped. He sputtered. "Now see here, Evelyn, that's a very serious accusation. I guided this entire strategy." "Guided?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call taking my finalized 80-page report, putting your name on it, and changing the font? Because that's what my records show." I held up my personal tablet, which I'd discreetly brought with me, displaying the original file with its time-stamped creation and modification history, clearly showing my authorship. "And as for the data itself, while the projections on that slide are indeed mine, they are contingent on several key factors you've conveniently omitted to mention. Factors that dramatically alter the risk profile." Mr. Henderson finally spoke, his jovial demeanor vanishing. "Miss Hayes, what is the meaning of this? If you have concerns, they should have been addressed through the proper channels, not in front of our shareholders." His voice was low, menacing. "With all due respect, Mr. Henderson," I said, meeting his gaze unflinchingly, "the proper channels in this company have a tendency to silence, dismiss, or appropriate the work of female employees. I felt this particular audience needed to hear the unvarnished truth, especially considering the financial implications." I turned my attention back to the shareholders. "Gentlemen, the expansion strategy David is presenting relies heavily on the renewal of a significant private credit line, which, as I understand it, is currently under review. Is that correct, Mr. Henderson?" Henderson looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. "That is a confidential internal matter, Miss Hayes. Not so confidential when the viability of your entire 3-year plan hinges on it," I countered. "And certainly not confidential to the entity providing that credit line." I paused, letting the suspense build. This was it, the moment I'd been both dreading and craving. "You see, that credit line, the largest single source of private financing for Sterling Price Investments, is provided by a firm called Northwood Advisory Group." A few shareholders nodded. The name was obscure enough not to ring immediate alarm bells for most, but significant enough for those in deep finance to recognize. "And Northwood Advisory Group," I continued, my voice clear and steady, "is a wholly owned subsidiary of Hayes Capital." The name Hayes dropped into the room like a bomb. I saw a flicker of recognition, then dawning horror on several faces. Mr. Albright, the one who'd winked at me over his coffee, suddenly looked very pale. David looked utterly bewildered, as if I'd started speaking in tongues. But it was Mr. Henderson whose reaction was the most gratifying. His face went from red to a ghastly, mottled white. He knew the Hayes name. Everyone in serious finance knew the Hayes name. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, speechless. "My name," I stated, letting the pieces click into place for them, "is Evelyn Hayes. Catherine Hayes, the CEO of Hayes Capital, is my mother. Alistair Hayes, its founder, is my grandfather." I let that sink in. The silence in the room was so profound, you could hear a pin drop. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector, still displaying David's, or rather, my, optimistic projections. "And Hayes Capital," I continued, my voice now carrying the full weight of my authority, "has been reviewing the performance and leadership of Sterling Price Investments very, very closely in relation to that credit line, especially concerning its internal controls, ethical practices, and the accuracy of the information provided to its lenders." I looked directly at David, then at Henderson. Frankly, based on what I've experienced and witnessed firsthand over the past 5 years, and particularly based on the blatant misrepresentation and intellectual property theft demonstrated here today, we have serious concerns. I took a deep breath. Therefore, as of this morning, I have been authorized by the board of Hayes Capital to inform you, Mr. Henderson and the shareholders present that Hayes Capital will not be renewing Sterling Price Investments' credit line next month. Furthermore, we will be exercising our option to call in the outstanding principal balance at the earliest contractually permissible date due to material misrepresentation and a fundamental loss of confidence in the current management. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Gasps, shocked murmurs. One elderly shareholder actually clutched his chest. David Miller looked like he was about to faint. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. Mark Jenkins, the golden boy, seemed to shrink in his chair, all his smarmy confidence gone, replaced by a look of pure panic. Mr. Henderson finally found his voice, though it was a strangled, desperate croak. You can't do this. This is personal. You're just bitter. I allowed myself a small, cold smile. Personal, Mr. Henderson? Perhaps being asked to serve coffee at a meeting where my work is being stolen and presented as the basis for your company's future is a little personal. But this decision is purely business. Hayes Capital has a fiduciary duty to its own investors. And investing in a company with such demonstrably flawed leadership and unethical practices as Sterling Price would be a breach of that duty. I looked around the room, at the stunned faces of the men who just minutes before had seen me as nothing more than a glorified waitress. The presentation David was giving? It's largely fiction without that financing. The 25% profit increase? Impossible. Gentlemen, I suggest you ask Mr. Henderson and Mr. Miller for a more realistic assessment of Sterling Price's future now that their primary lifeline is about to be cut. I gestured towards the now useless coffee carafe. Perhaps they can discuss it over a fresh pot. I, however, have another meeting to attend, at Hayes Capital, where my work is actually valued. With that, I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos and disbelief. The silence that followed my exit was, I imagined, deafening. The taste of victory was sweeter than any coffee they could have offered. What would you have done in my shoes at that exact moment? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying this takedown, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Walking out of that boardroom was like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin I'd worn for 5 years. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could almost feel the shockwaves emanating from the room, the frantic whispers, the dawning realization of the abyss Sterling Price Investments was now facing. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Blocked numbers, David, even Henderson's personal assistant. But I ignored them all. I had one call to make. It's done, I said, my voice calm as my mother picked up on the first ring. And? She asked, a hint of amusement in her tone. She knew me well. And I believe the term apoplectic might be an understatement for Mr. Henderson's current state, I replied, allowing myself a small smile as I stepped out into the bright city sunlight. The coffee was terrible, by the way. My mother laughed, a rich, genuine sound. I never doubted you for a moment, Evie. Your grandfather would be immensely proud. He always said, never underestimate the quiet ones. They're the ones listening. Now, come home. We have a company to run, properly this time. The aftermath at Sterling Price, as I later pieced together from industry chatter and a few hushed, apologetic calls from former colleagues who suddenly remembered my existence, was swift and brutal. The news of Hayes Capital pulling their financing spread like wildfire through the financial district. Shareholder confidence, already shaken by the public revelation of internal fraud and incompetence, plummeted. Other creditors, spooked by Hayes Capital's decisive action, began to review their own exposure. Sterling Price was suddenly radioactive. Within a week, Mr. Henderson was forced to resign by the remaining board members in a desperate attempt to salvage the company's reputation. His tearful, rambling farewell memo, leaked to the press, blamed unforeseen market volatility and disloyal elements without, of course, mentioning his own catastrophic misjudgment or the coffee incident. David Miller was fired unceremoniously, his career in finance likely over. The Miller risk paradigm became an internal joke, a cautionary tale about intellectual theft. Mark Jenkins, I heard, was desperately trying to find a new position, but his association with the Sterling Price debacle made him toxic. He learned the hard way that sycophancy only gets you so far when the ship is sinking. A few days after the meeting, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Mr. Albright, the shareholder I'd served coffee to, the one who'd winked. His tone was considerably more humble now. He apologized profusely for the unfortunate misunderstanding in the boardroom. He said he'd always sensed my potential, a blatant lie, but amusing nonetheless, and wondered if, perhaps, Hayes Capital might be interested in discussing. Well, he didn't quite get to what he wanted to discuss, because I politely but firmly cut him off. Mr. Albright, I said, Hayes Capital has a very clear investment strategy, and it does not involve propping up firms with a demonstrated history of unethical behavior and a culture that devalues its talent. As for my potential, I'm quite happy exploring it where it's genuinely appreciated. I wished him well in his future endeavors and ended the call. False apologies, offered only when the power dynamic has shifted, are worthless. Then came the calls from David. The first few were frantic, almost incoherent, a mixture of threats and pleas. When those went unanswered, they shifted to desperate apologies. He left long, rambling voicemails about how he'd always been under immense pressure, how he saw me as a protege, another lie, and how this was all a terrible mistake. He even had the gall to suggest that maybe, if I spoke to my mother, we could work something out. I never returned his calls. His apologies were not for the years of theft and belittlement, but for getting caught. There's a profound difference. The only person from Sterling Price I willingly spoke to was Mr. Davies. He called me about a week later, his voice its usual quiet self. Miss Hayes, he said. Or should I say, Ms. Hayes of Hayes Capital. There was a gentle warmth in his tone. Mr. Davies, I replied, genuinely pleased to hear from him. Evelyn is fine, and thank you for everything. I did very little, Evelyn, he said. You were the one with the courage and the strategy. I merely observed. Though I must admit, he added, a rare chuckle in his voice, the board meeting sounded rather eventful. Old Mr. Carmichael, who stole Eleanor Vance's work, would have been quite surprised to see a modern-day Eleanor fight back so effectively. He showed me the way, I said, thinking of the quiet solidarity he'd offered. We spoke for a while longer. He told me the archives were in chaos, with interim managers demanding documents they didn't understand. He was, he said, considering a long-overdue retirement. I told him that if he ever wanted to curate a private financial archive with a significantly better budget and appreciation for historical detail, Hayes Capital would be very interested. He demurred politely, but I could hear the smile in his voice. The dynamic had indeed shifted. I was no longer the invisible analyst. I was Evelyn Hayes, a key figure at one of S&P's most respected private equity firms. The transition wasn't just about a new title or a bigger office. It was about an internal shift. The years of doubt, of questioning my own worth began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing I had faced down my tormentors and won, not just through power, but through competence and resilience. I established new boundaries, not just professionally, but personally. I learned to say no without apology. I learned that my voice deserved to be heard, not because of my family name, but because of the value of my ideas. The experience at Sterling Price, as painful as it was, had inadvertently forged me into someone stronger, someone who understood the true meaning of power, not the blustering, arrogant kind displayed by Henderson and David, but the quiet, strategic power that comes from knowing your worth and being willing to fight for it. The satisfaction wasn't just in their downfall, but in my own rise, on my own terms. Looking back on that whole saga with Sterling Price, it's easy to focus on the dramatic climax, the moment the tables turned so spectacularly. And yes, there was a deep, undeniable satisfaction in seeing Henderson and David get their comeuppance, in watching their arrogant world crumble, because they were too blinded by their prejudice to see who I truly was. That moment in the boardroom was more than just revenge. It was a reckoning. It was the culmination of 5 years of swallowed pride, stolen credit, and the constant grinding weight of being underestimated. But the real victory, the one that resonates with me long after the dust has settled, isn't just about their downfall. It's about what I learned about myself, about resilience, and about the true nature of value. For so long, I let their definition of me shape my own self-perception. I was kiddo, sweetheart, the doll who could fetch coffee. I was the quiet, diligent worker bee whose ideas were ripe for the picking. Their constant diminishment made me question my own abilities, my own judgment. I internalized so much of their condescension. The truth is, my family's influence provided the weapon, but it was my own hard work, my own intellect, and ultimately, my own decision to fight back that pulled the trigger. The silent rise wasn't just about working behind the scenes for Hays Capital. It was about rediscovering my own voice, my own power, in an environment that tried its best to extinguish it. It was about realizing that my worth wasn't tied to their approval or their recognition. My value was inherent, built on my skills, my integrity, and my refusal to be permanently broken by their toxicity. That day, when I picked up that coffee carafe, something inside me finally snapped. But it wasn't a snap of despair. It was a snap of clarity. I saw them for what they were: small men, propped up by a system that rewarded bluster over substance, connections over competence. And I realized I didn't have to play their game anymore. I could change the rules. I could, in fact, own the entire stadium. Empowerment isn't just about having power, it's about recognizing the power you already possess, even when others try to convince you it doesn't exist. It's about cultivating your strengths in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step into the light, not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows their worth. It's about understanding that true strength isn't about how loudly you shout, but how effectively you plan, prepare, and execute. My journey at Sterling Price was a painful one. There's no denying it. But it was also a crucible. It forged me. It taught me lessons I wouldn't have learned in 1,000 comfortable boardrooms. It taught me the importance of allies, like Mr. Davies, who see your light even when you're surrounded by darkness. It taught me the insidious nature of subtle sexism and the corrosive effect of unchecked favoritism. And most importantly, it taught me that you can endure humiliation, you can weather injustice, and you can emerge not just intact, but stronger, more focused, and ready to claim what is rightfully yours. The world of corporate finance, and indeed many workplaces, can still be a challenging landscape for women. The biases are often deeply ingrained, the slights subtle but persistent. But stories like mine, I hope, serve as a reminder that we are not powerless. We have intellect, we have resilience, and sometimes we have access to resources and networks that the arrogant and dismissive never see coming. So what's the takeaway from all this? Value yourself, even when others don't. Document everything: your work, your ideas, the injustices you face. Cultivate your skills and your network, quietly and consistently. And never, ever let anyone make you feel like you're just there to serve the coffee, unless you're planning to use that coffee to serve them a very cold dish of reality. My story had a rather dramatic turn, thanks to my family's unique position. But the core of it, the feeling of being undervalued, of having your contributions ignored or stolen, that's a universal experience for so many. What about you? Have you ever had a moment at work where you were profoundly underestimated, only to find a way to turn the tables or prove your true worth? I'd love to hear your stories of resilience and triumph, big or small, in the comments below. Let's share our experiences and show each other that we're not alone in these struggles. And if this story inspired you or resonated with your own journey, please subscribe to the channel for more stories of empowerment and sweet, sweet revenge. Your support helps us keep these narratives alive.